They took her rifle because the paperwork said she was broken. That was the first mistake, believing the paperwork. Sergeant Alara Vance stood before the commander of Fort Greystone, a man whose crisp uniform and polished desk seemed to be his primary qualifications. Colonel Thorne held a thin manila folder, her entire career redacted into near invisibility. He saw a problem to be managed, a piece of administrative friction. He didn't see the woman who had learned to read terrain like a language and the intentions of men like a weather forecast. He saw only a gap in a checklist. "Sergeant," Colonel Thorne began, his voice dry as the dust outside his window, "your file shows no marksmanship qualification within the last 24 months. Army Regulation 350-1 is quite clear. No qualification, no weapon." She said nothing. Her silence was a deep, still well, and he mistook its depth for emptiness. This was her second mistake. He thought her quiet was acquiescence, a surrender to the bureaucracy that had exiled her to this forgotten logistics hub. He couldn't know that in her silence, she was listening, not to his words, but to the unsteady rhythm of his breathing, the slight tremor in the hand that held her file, the way his eyes flickered to the commendations on his wall, as if to reassure himself. "Your M4 will be secured in the armory," he continued, gesturing vaguely as if swatting a fly. "You're assigned to Warehouse 7. Inventory. Report to Master Sergeant Cruz." Dismissed. The taking of her rifle was meant to be a final, bureaucratic neutering. An infantry soldier without a rifle is a contradiction, a story with its final chapter torn out. But they were about to learn a critical lesson, one not written in any field manual. For some people, the weapon is not the rifle in their hands. It's the mind that moves them. And Sergeant Alara Vance was about to remind them all of what a true weapon looked like. Part 1. Arrival in the Boneyard. Fort Greystone baked under a merciless sun, a sprawling grid of beige buildings and shimmering asphalt that served as the Army's oversized garage. It was a place where equipment went to die or be reborn, and, apparently, where careers did the same. Vance stepped off the transport bus, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The air was thick with the smells of diesel, hot tar, and institutional apathy. Her reporting in was a study in anticlimax. The staff sergeant at the reception center, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his uniform, glanced at her orders and grunted. "Quartermaster Company. 3rd Platoon. Welcome to the Boneyard, Sergeant." The nickname was delivered without irony, a simple statement of fact. She navigated the base with an unnerving economy of motion, her boots making little sound on the gravel paths. The barracks were a cacophony of loud music, louder arguments, and the clatter of dropped equipment. It was a stark contrast to the disciplined silence she was accustomed to, where every sound had a meaning and every movement a purpose. She found her assigned bunk, a lower metal frame with a mattress thin enough to feel the springs through. Her new roommates, a trio of specialists engrossed in a video game, barely acknowledged her presence. Vance unpacked with the methodical precision of a bomb disposal expert. Each item had a designated place in her footlocker, folded and arranged not just for neatness, but for immediate access in low light. Her spare uniforms, her field gear, the worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, all slotted into place. The process was a ritual, a way of imposing order on a chaotic environment. As she worked, she absorbed her surroundings. The barracks door had a faulty locking mechanism. The fire extinguisher by the exit was 2 months past its inspection date. The window at the end of the hall offered a clear line of sight to the arms room, whose single guard seemed more interested in his phone than his field of fire. Her first walk around the company area was a quiet reconnaissance. She noted the predictable patrol routes of the military police, the gaps in the perimeter fence near the motor pool where soldiers slipped out for unauthorized smoke breaks, the sluggish response time of the gate guards to non-standard vehicles. She saw the base not as a home, but as a tactical problem full of vulnerabilities. It was a landscape of complacency, and complacency was a weakness she knew how to exploit. Later that evening, a young private first class named Miller barely out of basic training, approached her bunk. "Hey, Sergeant. Heard you just got in. I'm Miller. If you need anything, just ask." He was nervous, his eagerness a stark contrast to the general lethargy of the unit. Vance simply nodded, her eyes distant. "Vance?" Miller fidgeted. "So, where were you before this?" Her gaze met his for a brief second, and for the first time, the private felt a chill despite the stifling heat of the barracks. There was something ancient in her eyes, a history that her youthful face betrayed. "Doesn't matter where I was," she said, her voice low and even. "All that matters is where I am." Miller stammered an excuse and retreated, leaving Vance to the silent calculus of her new reality. She was a predator in a petting zoo, surrounded by creatures who had forgotten the meaning of teeth. Part 2. The Dismissal. The summons to the colonel's office came the next morning. His headquarters was the only building on base with manicured grass out front. Inside, the air conditioning was a welcome shock. Colonel Thorne's office was immaculate, a shrine to his own career. Framed photos of him shaking hands with generals, ceremonial swords, and a bookshelf lined with military histories stood as silent testaments to a life lived by the book. Thorne didn't offer her a seat. He remained behind his large oak desk, a barrier between his authority and her anonymity. He tapped the thin folder with her name on it. "Sergeant Elara Vance," he said, as if the name itself were an anomaly. "Your file is sparse. A lot of black ink. It says you were an exceptional soldier. Infantry, Ranger qualified, top marksman in your battalion." He paused, letting the accolades hang in the air before shooting them down. "It also says you haven't touched a rifle for qualification in 2 years. That's a career killer for an infantry NCO. You know that?" "Yes, sir," Vance replied. Her voice was flat, betraying no emotion. She stood at a perfect parade rest, her posture a silent refutation of the broken soldier he assumed her to be. Thorne leaned forward, adopting a tone that was meant to be paternal but landed as condescending. "Look, Sergeant, I don't know what happened at your last duty station, and frankly, the Army doesn't want me to know. What I do know is that here, at Fort Greystone, we follow regulations. To the letter. It's what separates a disciplined force from a mob." He flipped a page in her file. "No current qualification means you are not authorized to carry a weapon on my installation. I'm having your assigned M4 formally transferred to the arms room for deep storage." He expected a reaction, an argument, a plea, a flash of anger. He got nothing but a quiet, "Understood, sir." Her calm unnerved him. It was unnatural. He had seen soldiers lose their careers, get demoted, face charges. They always showed something: fear, resentment, despair. Vance showed only a placid stillness that felt like a judgment. He mistook her discipline for detachment, her control for emotional damage. It was easier to file her away as a casualty of the system. "Your lack of recent trigger time makes you a liability," he declared, his voice hardening as he regained his footing. "So I'm putting you where you can't cause any trouble. You're on inventory duty, Warehouse 7. You'll count boxes until your next qualification cycle comes up. Maybe some time with a clipboard will help you reflect on the importance of following procedure." It was the ultimate insult. He wasn't just taking her weapon. He was taking her identity. An infantry sergeant's purpose was tied to the rifle, to the field, to the fight. He was sentencing her to a bureaucratic purgatory, a slow death by pallet counting. "Dismissed, Sergeant." Vance executed a flawless about-face and walked out of the office. She didn't look back. As she crossed the threshold, the colonel felt a fleeting sense of victory, the satisfaction of restoring order. He had taken the gun from the broken soldier. He had no idea that all he had done was make her angry, and for a woman like Vance, anger wasn't a loud, messy emotion. It was cold, sharp, and patient, and it was now focused entirely on his perfectly regulated world. Part 3. The Observation. Warehouse 7 was a cavernous metal tomb, smelling of dust, grease, and forgotten ambition. It was a cathedral of discarded military might, filled with pallets of spare engine parts, crates of outdated communication gear, and boxes of medical supplies nearing their expiration dates. It was here that Vance was meant to fade into obscurity. One more name on a roster, one more ghost in the machine. Master Sergeant Cruz, the warehouse supervisor, was a man in his final years before retirement, his cynicism as thick as the layer of dust on the high shelves. He handed Vance a clipboard and a digital scanner. "Here you go, Sergeant. Aisles A through G are yours. Count it, scan it, log it. Try not to die of boredom." He didn't care about her past or her problems. He just wanted the numbers to match. For the first few days, Vance did exactly as she was told. She counted, she scanned, she logged. But her mind was doing something else entirely. While her hands were busy, her eyes were cataloging. She wasn't just seeing boxes. She was seeing tactical opportunities and liabilities. She memorized the layout of the entire warehouse complex, not just her assigned section. She noted the inefficient stacking of pallets in aisle C, creating a perfect choke point. She saw the fire exits in the rear that were consistently blocked by forklifts, a safety violation that was also a concealed entry point. She tracked the patterns of the civilian forklift drivers, their predictable routes, their coffee breaks, the way Johnson in aisle F always took a long lunch at 1300. Her observation extended beyond the warehouse walls. During her breaks, she wouldn't sit with the other soldiers. She would find a vantage point, a loading dock, or a second-story window, and she would watch. She observed the flow of traffic on the base, the shift changes for the MP patrols, the blind spots in the CCTV coverage around the perimeter. She noted that the security checks at the main gate grew lax after 1,800 hours, as the civilian guards tired and the military staff thinned out. She saw the loose panel in the chain-link fence behind the mess hall, used by soldiers to sneak back on base after a night in town. PFC Miller, the young soldier from the barracks, was also assigned to the warehouse. He saw her silent, ceaseless scanning and mistook it for a symptom of trauma. He tried to make small talk to draw her out of her shell. "Tough break getting stuck in here, Sergeant," he said one afternoon, leaning against a stack of crates. "Colonel Thorne can be a real piece of work. Taking a rifle like that, it's just wrong." Vance didn't look at him. Her eyes were tracing the steel support beams in the ceiling, assessing their load-bearing capacity and potential as anchoring points. She gave a non-committal grunt. "It's like they don't even see us down here," Miller continued, desperate to connect. "We're just numbers on a spreadsheet to them." Vance finally turned her head, her gaze sharp and focused. "They see what they expect to see, Miller. That's their weakness. They look at this place and see a warehouse. They look at us and see clerks." She tapped the side of her head. "They don't see the battle space." Miller didn't understand what she meant, but the intensity in her voice made him shiver. He thought she was just being philosophical, a little broken from whatever had happened to her. He didn't realize she was giving him the first lesson in a masterclass he didn't know he was taking. Alara Vance wasn't counting boxes. She was studying a battlefield, learning its rhythms and weaknesses, and patiently waiting for the war to come to her. Part 4. The pressure builds. The war came on a Tuesday, disguised as a training exercise. An alert blared across the base-wide public address system, a synthetic voice announcing, "Exercise, exercise, exercise. Fort Greystone is under simulated attack. Implement Force Protection Condition Delta." The announcement sent a ripple of confused energy through the base. For most soldiers at Greystone, it was a drill, a nuisance that broke the monotony. In the command center, however, it was chaos. Colonel Thorne, reveling in a chance to test his meticulously crafted response plans, stood before a bank of monitors, barking orders. "I want a full lockdown. Seal the perimeter. I want MP patrols covering all critical infrastructure. The power station, the comm center, my headquarters." But the plans, so perfect on paper, were crumbling upon contact with a dynamic adversary. The opposing force, or OPFOR, was a team of seasoned instructors from the Regional Training Center. They weren't actors. They were professionals who specialized in dismantling complacency. They knew every trick in the book because they had written half of them. Their first move was a classic diversion. A simulated fire broke out in the motor pool, drawing the bulk of Thorne's quick reaction force to the opposite side of the base. While the MPs were busy cordoning off smoking, harmless chemical lights. A second OPFOR element cut the fiber optic cables to the northern sector, blacking out a third of the base's surveillance cameras. Thorne, in his command bunker, saw his tactical map blinking with red icons. His neat, orderly world was descending into a panicked mess of contradictory reports. "Where are they?" he snapped at his intelligence officer, who could only shrug helplessly. The true objective was not the power station or the headquarters. It was the forgotten, dusty heart of the logistics network, Warehouse 7. Stored deep within its neglected aisles was a pallet of next-generation satellite communication arrays, critical equipment scheduled for immediate deployment to a forward operating base. For the purposes of the exercise, destroying that pallet would mean mission failure for Fort Greystone. In the warehouse, Master Sergeant Cruz herded his bewildered soldiers into a designated safe room. "Just stay put until we get the all clear," he ordered, his voice lacking any real urgency. "It's just a drill." Vance didn't follow. She stood near the main loading bay doors, listening. She heard the distant sirens of the fire trucks heading the wrong way. She noted the sudden, unnatural silence in the radio chatter from the guard frequencies. She knew what it was. A feint, a misdirection. Her senses, honed in places where a single mistake meant death, told her the real threat was not far away. It was coming closer. PFC Miller found her there, his face pale with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Sergeant, shouldn't we be in the safe room?" Vance's eyes were fixed on a massive roll-up door. "A safe room is only safe if the enemy doesn't know where it is," she said, her voice a low murmur. "And a cage is still a cage." Through the thick metal of the door, she felt it before she heard it, a subtle vibration. A heavy vehicle stopping just outside. Then the faint metallic click of breaching tools being set against the lock. The pressure was no longer a distant alarm. It was at their door. While the rest of the base was chasing shadows, the wolves had arrived at the sheep pen, and they were about to find the shepherd was not what they expected. Part 5, The Intervention. The lock on the warehouse side door snapped with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward. 5 men, clad in black training gear and carrying blue mark simulation rifles, spilled into the cavernous space. They moved with the confident swagger of professionals who expected no resistance. Their leader, a broad-shouldered sergeant with instructor tabs on his sleeve, scanned the vast interior, his eyes sweeping over the endless rows of pallets. "Clear," one of his men shouted. "Looks like they all ran and hid." The leader grinned. "Easy day. Find the comms gear. It's marked with high-priority tags. Let's tag it, bag it, and call a win." Then he saw her. Alara Vance stood near a cluttered inventory desk, clipboard still in hand, watching them with an unnerving calm. She was not panicked. She was not surrendering. She was observing. The OPFOR leader's grin widened. This was a bonus. Well, looks like we got a hero. "On the ground, Sergeant. Hands where I can see them," he barked, leveling his simulated M4. Vance didn't move. She let the clipboard fall from her hand, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a signal to herself. The time for observation was over. 2 of the OPFOR soldiers moved to restrain her, their movements sloppy and overconfident. They were treating it as a drill, a simple matter of procedure. They didn't see the subtle shift in her weight, the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her eyes went flat and cold. They didn't see the predator uncoil. The first man reached for her arm. Vance pivoted, not away from him, but into him. Her motion was a blur. She used his own momentum against him, guiding his grasping hand past her as her other hand came up, the hard edge of the clipboard she just dropped catching him squarely under the chin. It wasn't a knockout blow, but stunned him, his head snapping back. Before he could recover, she drove her boot into the back of his knee, buckling the joint and sending him crashing into a nearby stack of oil filters. One down. The second man, surprised by the sudden violence, lunged forward. Vance met his charge with a palm heel strike to the bridge of his nose. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage, and the man staggered back, eyes watering, his rifle clattering to the concrete floor. As he reeled, she swept his feet from under him. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. 2 down. The remaining 3, including the leader, were momentarily frozen in shock. The whole exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. Their drill had just become very, very real. "What the hell?" the leader yelled, finally raising his rifle. But Vance was already moving. She snatched a heavy, solid metal scanner gun from the inventory desk and hurled it at the third man, hitting him in the temple. He dropped like a stone. 3 down. She closed the distance to the last 2 before they could properly aim. She moved in a low crouch, using the desks and pallets as intermittent cover. The fourth man tried to bring his rifle to bear, but she was too close. She slammed her shoulder into his midsection, driving him backward into a metal shelving unit. The shelves, improperly loaded as she had noted weeks ago, swayed and then collapsed, burying him in a cascade of spare truck parts. 4 down. Now it was just her and the leader. He stood, rifle up, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He was an instructor, a hand-to-hand combat expert. He had never seen anything like this. It wasn't a fight. It was a disassembly. "Exercise over," he managed to yell, a desperate attempt to regain control. Vance stopped a few feet from him, her breathing even, her stance perfectly balanced. She hadn't broken a sweat. "You don't get to call it over," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You lose, and it's over." She feinted left, and when he reflexively shifted his aim, she exploded forward on the right. She didn't go for his weapon. She went for him. An elbow strike to the brachial nerve in his shoulder made his arm go numb, his rifle slipping from his grasp. A precise knee to the femoral nerve on his inner thigh deadened his leg. He crumpled to the floor, not unconscious, but completely incapacitated, a puppet with its strings cut. 5 down. Vance stood over them, the only one left standing amidst the quiet groans and the scattered equipment. She hadn't used a gun. She hadn't even thrown a proper punch. It was a brutal, efficient symphony of applied physics and anatomy. She looked at the 5 disabled professionals on the floor, then calmly walked back to the desk, picked up her clipboard, and made a small notation. Part 6, the shift. The first to arrive were the exercise controllers, their white armbands a stark contrast to the gloom of the warehouse. They followed the GPS trackers on the OPFOR team's vests, which had all gone black, signaling incapacitated they expected to find a successful raid, maybe a single guard role-playing as a casualty. They did not expect to find the entire 5-man professional OPFOR team scattered across the floor like discarded toys. Colonel Thorne arrived moments later, his face flushed with anger and confusion. He strode into the warehouse flanked by his XO and the base sergeant major, ready to demand answers for the communications blackout from the captured OPFOR team. He stopped dead in his tracks at the scene before him. The OPFOR leader, the grizzled master sergeant, was propped up against a pallet, wincing as he tried to rub feeling back into his arm. The other 4 were in various states of disarray, being checked over by the exercise medics. "What in God's name happened here?" Thorne demanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. The OPFOR leader looked up, his face a mask of grudging respect. "She happened, Colonel." He nodded toward the far end of the aisle. Thorne followed his gaze. There, standing with perfect military bearing beside an inventory terminal, was Sergeant Alara Vance. Her uniform was immaculate. Not a hair was out of place. She looked as if she had been cataloging supplies the entire time. "Sergeant Vance?" Thorne said, the name coming out as a question. "What did you do?" Before she could answer, one of the younger OPFOR soldiers, a staff sergeant with a welt forming on his cheek, pushed himself to a sitting position. "Do? Sir, she dismantled us. Took us apart in, I don't know, 5 seconds? 10? I never even saw her move. It was like fighting a ghost." The exercise controller, a lieutenant colonel with a clipboard, knelt beside the OPFOR leader. "Your men are armed." "She's not." "How is this possible?" The leader just shook his head. "We weren't fighting a quartermaster clerk, sir. I don't know what she is, but she ain't that. She used the environment, our own momentum. It was a clinic. A damn brutal clinic." Colonel Thorne stared at Vance, his mind struggling to reconcile the quiet, broken soldier from his office with a human weapon being described by these experts. The dismissiveness he had felt was evaporating, replaced by a profound and unsettling curiosity. Who was this woman? PFC Miller, who had watched the entire event from the relative safety of a forklift shadow, finally emerged, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hero worship. "It's true, sir. All of it. They came in, and she just neutralized them. It was wow." The whispers started almost immediately. The controllers, the MPs, the medics, they all saw the result. 5 elite aggressors, taken down by one unarmed logistics sergeant. The story spread from the warehouse like a shockwave, mutating and growing with each telling. By lunchtime, the rumor on base was that a lone female NCO had single-handedly fought off a dozen armed intruders with nothing but a ballpoint pen. Thorne walked slowly toward Vance, his polished boots loud on the concrete. He stopped in front of her, searching her face for some sign, arrogance, fear, anything. He found only calm composure. "Sergeant," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension, "I'm going to need a full report." "Yes, sir," Vance replied evenly. 5 hostiles entered the facility. I engaged and subdued them. Secured the primary objective. Warehouse is secure. It was the most understated after-action report he had ever heard. The shift in the air was palpable. The equation had changed. Sergeant Vance was no longer a problem to be managed. She was an enigma to be solved. And Colonel Thorne was beginning to suspect that his orderly, predictable base was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Part 7. The second test. The exercise director, a visiting brigadier general named Hayes, who had been observing from the command center, declared a pause to reset the scenario. The initial op for assault was a failure, but the larger exercise wasn't over. To salvage the training value, he devised a new, more difficult problem. "All right, Phase 2, Hayes announced over the command net. "The primary op for element, learning from their failed warehouse raid, has executed a direct action mission. They have seized control of the Fort Greystone Command Center. Colonel Thorne and his staff are now considered hostages. The simulated bomb, represented by a briefcase with a ticking clock, was placed in the middle of the command floor. The base response team has 30 minutes to neutralize the threat and rescue the hostages. The base's designated emergency response team, a hastily assembled squad of MPs, was immediately caught in a secondary ambush near the barracks, another clever play by the OPFOR instructors. They were pinned down, neutralized for the purpose of the drill. The base's command structure was decapitated, with Thorne now a role-player hostage. His executive officer, Major Davies, was in nominal control from a secondary site, but he was overwhelmed, his voice on the radio a panicked squeak. The lead OPFOR instructor from the warehouse incident, Master Sergeant Riker, sought out Vance. He found her back at her workstation, cleaning the scuff marks from the floor where his men had fallen. He approached her not as an adversary, but as a fellow professional. "Sergeant," Riker said, his arm now in a purely cosmetic sling to represent his injury, "we have a problem." Vance looked up from her work, her expression unreadable. "The command center is locked down," Riker explained, unrolling a set of blueprints on a nearby crate. 4 hostiles inside, including their team leader. They're dug in, covering the main entrance and the emergency exits. "My guys are good. A frontal assault by the MPs would be a massacre. The general wants to see if this base can think on its feet." He paused, looking her directly in the eye. "I saw how you think. What do you see?" Vance leaned over the blueprints, her eyes tracing the lines with an intensity that belied her calm demeanor. She ignored the obvious routes of attack. Her finger came to rest on a series of thin, dotted lines labeled HVAC maintenance ducting. It was a detail most would overlook. "Here," she said, tapping the print. "This air duct runs from the main utility corridor, over the server room, and has an exhaust grate right above the command floor's primary workstation cluster. They won't be watching the ceiling." Her mind flashed back to her first week, to her methodical, silent reconnaissance of the base's infrastructure. She had seen the access panel to that very duct behind a forgotten water heater in a janitor's closet. Riker stared at the blueprint, then back at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. You're kidding me. It's a crawl space. It's an infiltration route, Vance corrected him. They're expecting force. Give them finesse. I need 2 volunteers. No rifles. In that space, they're just liabilities. We go in quiet. The call for volunteers went out. PFC Miller, who had been shadowing Vance since the warehouse incident, immediately stepped forward, his face a mixture of terror and resolute determination. The second volunteer was a wiry communications specialist, a corporal who knew the server room layout better than anyone. Vance led them to the janitor's closet, pried open the access panel, and peered into the dark, dusty maw of the ductwork. Single file. No talking. Follow my signals. Move when I move, stop when I stop, she commanded in a whisper. She slid into the narrow space without a sound, a snake disappearing into a hole. Miller followed, his heart pounding against his ribs. The journey through the ducts was claustrophobic and tense. It was pitch black, hot, and the metal groaned under their weight. Vance moved with an eerie silence, her hands and feet finding purchase as if she could see in the dark. She guided them with taps on the shoulder, 1 for stop, 2 for go, a slow pressure for caution. For what felt like an eternity, they crawled through the metallic guts of the building, the muffled shouts of the OPFOR terrorists echoing from below, a grim reminder of the stakes. Part 8. The Reveal. They stopped above the gentle hum of servers. Vance put a finger to her lips, then pointed down. Through the slats of the grate, they could see the command center below. It was exactly as Riker had described. 2 OPFOR soldiers covered the main door, another watched the hostages, and the team leader stood by the simulated bomb, his hand hovering over the detonator. They were confident, their attention focused outward. Vance carefully, silently, worked the screws of the grate loose with a multi-tool. The metal cover came free with a barely audible sigh. The plan was simple, brutal, and relied on absolute surprise. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the guard nearest the hostages. Then she pointed to Miller and the comms corporal, and then to a large bank of servers on the far side of the room. Finally, she pointed to the OPFOR leader. Her hand signals were precise, unmistakable. I take the guard. You 2 create a diversion there. I take the leader. She lowered herself through the opening, landing as softly as a cat on top of a server rack. The OPFOR guard, distracted by a comment from his leader, never saw her coming. She dropped behind him, one hand clamping over his mouth, the other applying a perfect chokehold that would have rendered him unconscious in seconds. In the context of the drill, a firm tap on his shoulder signaled he was out. She laid him gently on the floor. On her signal, Miller and the corporal shoved a loose server rack. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clang of metal. Every OPFOR eye, including the leaders, snapped toward the sound. What was that? Check it out, he yelled. That was all the time she needed. While their heads were turned, Vance ghosted across the room, a shadow moving through the flickering lights of the computer terminals. The OPFOR leader turned back just in time to see her face. His eyes widened in recognition and horror, the woman from the warehouse. Before he could react, she drove the heel of her hand up under his chin, snapping his head back. A second strike to his solar plexus buckled him. His hand fell away from the detonator. The exercise was over. The command center fell into a stunned silence, broken only by General Hayes's voice booming over the speakers. End exercise. End exercise. Blue Force is victorious. Later, in the formal debriefing, the entire command staff was assembled. Colonel Thorne, now freed from his role as a hostage, sat stiffly at the main table, his face a thunderous mask of confusion and embarrassment. General Hayes stood at the podium, reviewing the timeline of events. The initial base response was, to be frank, abysmal, the general stated bluntly. However, the situation was salvaged by the unconventional actions of one NCO. He looked down at his notes. Sergeant Alara Vance. He paused, then looked over his glasses at a nervous-looking aide. Captain, give me Sergeant Vance's full 201 file. The unredacted version. Use my authority. A few minutes later, the captain returned with a tablet and handed it to the general. Hay scrolled through it, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. A low whistle escaped his lips. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing squarely on Colonel Thorne. "Colonel," the general said, his voice now dangerously low, "do you have any earthly idea who you assigned to count packing crates in Warehouse 7? Thorne remained silent. "This is Sergeant First Class Elara Vance," Hayes announced, his voice filling the auditorium. "Her last assignment was with the Joint Special Operations Command, attached to Task Force 11. She has 5 combat deployments to her name, all to places that officially we've never been. The reason her file is scrubbed and she hasn't qualified on a standard rifle in 2 years is because for the last 36 months, her primary weapon system was a highly classified, suppressed variant of the 417 Hong Kong dollars, and her qualification range was a live combat zone." A collective gasp went through the room. Task Force 11 was the stuff of legends, the tip of the military spear. The general wasn't finished. He looked directly at Thorne, his eyes cold. Her operational call sign was Nix. If Task Force 11 was a legend, Nix was a myth. A ghost story whispered by operators about an operative who could move unseen and strike from nowhere. The name hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications of skill, sacrifice, and lethality. The reason for her presence at Fort Greystone remained classified, a silent testament to a mission that had cost her something profound, but her identity was no longer a secret. The broken soldier from the paperwork was a phantom, and the real woman was one of the most elite soldiers in the United States military. Part 9. The Respect. The next morning, the air at Fort Greystone had changed. The story of the warehouse and the command center takedown, now fused with the legendary call sign Nix, had saturated every corner of the base. The quiet, unassuming logistics sergeant was no longer an object of pity or curiosity. She was a figure of awe. As Vance walked from her barracks toward the warehouses for her morning shift, she felt the change. It wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was in the small things. The way soldiers would stop their conversations as she passed, their eyes following her with a newfound reverence. The way they straightened their posture, their movements becoming a little more military, a little more crisp, as if her mere presence demanded a higher standard. She crossed the main parade ground where a platoon of infantrymen, trucked in for a support rotation, was in the middle of physical training. As she drew near, the platoon sergeant, a hardened combat veteran with 3 tours on his sleeve, saw her. He didn't hesitate. "Platoon, attention," he roared. The grunting and sweating stopped instantly. 20 soldiers snapped to the position of attention. The platoon sergeant turned to face Vance, his back ramrod straight, and rendered the sharpest, most profound salute of his career. It wasn't the perfunctory salute required for an officer. It was a gesture of deep, earned military respect from one warrior to another, a public acknowledgement of her skill and sacrifice. His entire platoon followed his lead, their salutes a silent, unified chorus of esteem. Vance paused. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. She returned the salute with equal precision, a slight nod of her head acknowledging the gesture. She didn't bask in it. She simply accepted it and continued on her way. This scene repeated itself in smaller ways throughout the day. NCOs who had previously ignored her now nodded in greeting. Officers who had seen her as a piece of administrative baggage now met her eyes with curiosity and deference. PFC Miller, emboldened, now walked a few respectful paces behind her, asking quiet, intelligent questions about tactical movement and situational awareness, an eager student who had found his master. Late that afternoon, Colonel Thorne found her outside Warehouse 7. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept. The blustering authority was gone, replaced by a somber humility. He was a man who had discovered a priceless artifact was being used as a doorstop. He didn't offer a clumsy apology. His pride wouldn't allow it, and he knew her well enough now to understand that she wouldn't want it. Instead, he held out a small, laminated card. It was a rifle chit from the arms room. "Sergeant," he said, his voice formal but stripped of all condescension. Your weapon is waiting for you at the armory. I've taken the liberty of scheduling a priority qualification range for you. This afternoon, 1,600 hours. He paused, meeting her gaze. I'll be observing. From a tower. It was more than just returning her rifle. It was an admission of his mistake. It was an act of trust. He wasn't just giving her back a piece of equipment. He was acknowledging her identity, an identity he had tried to strip away with a signature on a piece of paper. Vance took the card from his hand. Their fingers brushed for a moment. She looked from the card to the colonel's face, seeing the profound shift in his understanding. Thank you, sir, she said. It was all that needed to be said. The battle for Fort Greystone was over. Respect had been earned not with words, but with action. And now, it was time for the warrior to be made whole again. Part 10. The Closure. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long, stark shadows across the empty firing range. It was the golden hour, a time of quiet reflection, and the only sounds were the gentle breeze whispering through the dry grass and the distant hum of the bass winding down. Sergeant Alara Vance stood alone at the firing line. The armorer, a young specialist who handled the weapon with the reverence of a holy relic, had already placed the M4 rifle on the shooting bench. It was her rifle. She could tell by the slight, familiar wear on the pistol grip and the faint scratch near the ejection port. She walked forward, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She didn't snatch the weapon up. She approached it as one would an old friend after a long absence. Her fingers traced the cold steel of the barrel, then wrapped around the grip. When she lifted it, it settled into the crook of her shoulder with a seamless, perfect fit. It felt less like holding a tool and more like completing a circuit. A vital part of her that had been missing was now restored. She chambered around, the metallic clack of the bolts sliding home, a sharp, definitive sound in the twilight calm. She didn't rush. Lying prone, she took her time, aligning the sights, controlling her breathing until it was a slow, steady rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The world narrowed to the front sight post and the distant paper target, 300 meters away. From the observation tower, Colonel Thorne watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars. General Hayes stood beside him, silent. They weren't there to judge her marksmanship. They were there to witness a restoration. Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that echoed off the nearby hills. She didn't immediately look at the result. She fired again, and again, a steady, rhythmic pattern of fire. 10 shots in total, each one preceded by the same patient, disciplined process. When she was done, she cleared the weapon and laid it gently back on the bench. She stood up and looked toward the tower, her face impassive in the fading light. In the tower, Thorne focused his binoculars on the target. He didn't see 10 separate bullet holes. He saw one single, ragged tear in the center of the paper, a grouping so tight it was almost unbelievable. It was a testament not just to skill, but to a level of mastery that bordered on art. My God, Thorne whispered, lowering the binoculars. Vance stood at the firing line, the rifle resting on the bench before her, the faint, acrid scent of cordite clinging to the air like incense. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The quiet confidence, the sense of centeredness had returned. She was no longer a sergeant in a warehouse. She was Nyx. She was whole. The image lingered in Thorne's mind. The lone soldier silhouetted against the dying sun, her weapon finally back in her hands. It was not a symbol of violence, but of an identity reclaimed, of respect earned through undeniable competence. The paperwork had been proven wrong. The system had been corrected. And at the heart of the boneyard, a warrior was once again ready for the fight.